to justify this kind of trap, and two is in terms of actually how loans have been treated. So one is the example that keeps going around has been the Sri Lankan port, right? Wait, I have the name down. Hambantota. Sorry, I don't know if that's the correct saying, but Hambantota port.
I'll take it.
Essentially, so Sri Lanka, for those who don't know, is in Asia. It's in a strategic position for the kind of like Indian Ocean shipping route. So China would kind of pass it on its way to North Africa and then can also access Europe and other parts of the world, right? And essentially, I think it was in 2003, there was a proposal made around building a port there that would, again, give revenue to the country. Remember, at the time, Sri Lanka, since 1983, had been, embroiled in a civil war that only ended in 2009. So they're in a very difficult position. But basically, they do kind of feasibility studies. They get actually Canadians and I think it was a Dutch company to do these feasibility studies, which basically show that it is viable within certain constraints. And by 2007, Sri Lanka approaches, actually not China, approaches India and the US, asking, hey, we have this proposal. What do you guys think? But US and India both decline. So then they approach China, and China basically approves or says we can have an offer of like a $300 million loan. It will be 15-year repayment with 4 years of a grace period. And the president at the time of Sri Lanka accepts this. And again, remember, they're ending their civil war in 2009. A global recession is unfolding. There's a lot of political instability within the country, right? And at the time, I think it was by 2015, they were like actually beginning the process, and or the process is unfolding of the like completion of the port. But what happens is that they're struggling to pay all their like national debts, their international bonds, and Sri Lanka chooses, because of the internal dynamics, chooses to privatize the port, and the port goes in the hands of China Merchants, which is a state-owned enterprise from China. And basically, using the revenues from privatizing that port, they're able to pay their debts and service any kind of national issues. So what the US has been saying, which maybe I didn't say that in the beginning, what the US has been saying and punting is that China seized this port and forcefully took it after creating a series of predatory, debt and loan agreements, when in fact there was a lot of historical and internal dynamics that led the Sri Lankan government to choose to privatize that port and let the operations go over to this Chinese company. So that's the example that's often referred to, which is actually incorrect in terms of the facts of what happened. Then two, in terms of loan repayments or loans in general, as you mentioned, China tends to give less conditionalities, much longer time periods for repayment. But the US refuses to acknowledge the fact that the Chinese have a more flexible and long-term understanding of these loans. And the reality is that even during the pandemic and a couple of years before that, China has consistently tried to find, and again, not because China's the benevolent, overseer, but because there's negotiations and they treat Africans, members of the global South countries, as equal participants who are able to pursue their interests and who should be able to push for their interests, right? So, basically, China's canceled debts, deferred debts, restructured debts, according to various contexts, and they do differ, and there is argument on which countries get loans canceled for what reasons. But ultimately, we've seen a history of more favorable terms. And I think China's renegotiated, I think it was or it was in 2019, they deferred and renegotiated 50 billion, I think, of loans.
Yeah.
And countries like Cuba in 2010, struggling under US imposed, sanctions, struggling to get resources in the country, struggling to get financing in the country. They got a debt of $2.8 billion written off in 2010. So, historically, we've seen much more favorable terms from China. And it does come from a theory of, I think they call it patient capital, where it's not about reaping the rewards of tomorrow. It's about building these longer relationships. And in many cases, there are certain investments that they know. I think it's in Pakistan. where they know that like 80% of their investments won't be recovered just based on the conditions that are there. So I think this understanding of, patient capital, of a certain social responsibility is there that isn't at all in the ambit of US and European approaches to aid and investment on the African continent.
Right. It's often left out that, like you mentioned, China actually ends up ultimately losing money, right? And in a lot of these projects. And so, Kambale, I wanted to bring this issue to you because this is recently in the news. And that was this issue of these Chinese companies in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the DRC. Basically, the Chinese companies that are working there were suspended over illegal activities. And the response from China was so interesting. Beijing basically followed up by saying they're going to impose sanctions on these Chinese companies if they're found guilty, which I think is pretty stunning and remarkable, just because I maybe I could be wrong, but I can't think of a case where the US or Europe or Canada did something similar based on illegal activities of their many, many exploitative companies across the African continent. But I guess my question for you is, can you talk a little bit about what happened with that situation? And what is, I guess, the American role in the DRC compared with the Chinese role? How would you compare their actions?
I mean, the announcement, I think most people they've missed actually what happened. It's very historic for a nation such as China to sanction companies that have been shown to have done something bad. And you kind of mentioned it, right? That we have foreign corporations, Western corporations, with so much documentation from the United Nations report, from OECD complaints from the ground. The reports exist. Curse of Gold, written by, for example, Human Rights Watch, that documented Bonro, who built a house for rebel groups, provided them with private jets, and never been sanctioned till today. You have Barrick. I mean, the companies are there. Actually, we even created a website called Conflict Minerals, where we listed the names of 85 Western companies implicated in the pilfering of Congo's resources. None of them have ever been sanctioned whatsoever. So this sanction on the 6 Chinese companies comes from a documentary that was released by a Cameroonian journalist, Foka, who did a documentary targeting a Chinese mining company, showed what was actually taking place in terms of the illegal exploitation. When the information became public, China took action. So as we see that, the fundamental question will be, is China as a state exploiting the Congo? Because it's taken out of context. You have a private company that is doing illegal operations, have been exposed, and the country takes action to hold them into account. Is that the Chinese state condoning this behavior? That's not the case. But now the question will come to Freeport-McMoRan, the American company that used to have the largest copper reserve. Dan Rather did a report that was actually nominated for an Emmy, that did not win an Emmy, a few years back. They went on the ground, saw Freeport-McMoRan based out of Phoenix, Arizona, where they had the largest copper reserve and cobalt mine. They promised to the community to build houses for them, promised to build a clinic for them, provide water and roads for them. They never did, but this is what they told the investors. And then rather filmed the community. They did not receive what they were promised, and they were displaced. And this is the largest copper reserve owned by a company based out of Phoenix, Arizona. This documentary came out. The report came out. Nothing actually happened. But you know what actually unfolded for the Freeport-McMoRan case? Surprisingly, that the contract that Freeport had for this Tege Fungurume mine was facilitated by a member of the U.S. Embassy in Kinshasa. It's Henderson, right? She was the political attaché at the U.S. Embassy. So it's in this Dan Rather report, right? Then, after she left the U.S. Embassy, you know who she became? She is currently the vice president of Freeport-McMoRan. From the U.S. Embassy to now the vice president of Freeport. Reports came out showing how there is actually conflict of interest of government officials who put pressure on the Congolese government to allow an American company to get access to this mine, showed what happened to the Congolese community, the Congolese people who live where the copper was. Nothing else ever happened up until today. The information is there. So I understood actually the negative press around these 6 mining companies from a larger scale of what the anti-Chinese sentiment hysteria that's happening on the African continent. That is not based on facts. That is not based on the reality of what's taking place. And when China takes action, of course, it's not mentioning in the press clearly what China is actually doing. But that's not really what should the discussion be, right? Even with the United States, their actions on the ground.
I was just going to say that's so interesting that you mentioned that the actual documentary you're saying came out of like an anti-China sentiment.
I mean, I don't know what the motive is for the filmmaker, but what I do know at the present time on the African continent, there is a hysteria around what China is doing in Africa, and it's not based on facts. The documentary itself talks about ending slave trade. China is not doing slave trade in Congo. I mean, it's an insult to really what slave trade actually mean. So filming a Chinese company doing mining that is illegal, where the Chinese government has taken action, does not translate to China enslaving Africans for extreme profit. Right?
And I do want to ask you, I do want to get into the issue of the kind of anti-China hysteria that that is happening across the continent. But before we do get into that, because I think that this is tangentially related, and this is, I guess, really a question that can go towards both of you. But I think people might be surprised to learn that AFRICOM, which is the U.S. military's African command, which was set up in 2007, has not been able to find a home on the African continent. In fact, the headquarters are in Germany, so in Europe, which I just think is interesting. I don't think when people think of AFRICOM, they don't really understand what it is, but they assume it's at least in Africa. And part of the reason it's not in Africa is because of a pushback from African people to pressure their governments not to give into U.S. demands to shift their headquarters from Europe to Africa. But I guess I'm curious, can you tell our listeners and viewers, what is the role of AFRICOM on the African continent, and how much of it is a reaction to preventing China's relationship with African countries from, becoming, a bigger one, I guess. And I don't know, Mika, if maybe you want to take that first.
Sure, because I think Kambale can give a very specific example of the DRC where it's very recently been manifest. So I think it's important again. So as a researcher in Tricontinental, we produced a study in July that we collaborated on with